on our tour today is a beautiful little Queen Anne cottage at 3050 N Street that we call the Tailor Cottage. Beautifully painted in what some people call the painted lady style. But these houses from the beginning were meant to emphasize decoration and a range of color and ornament, and this one does it beautifully. It's really one of the best Queen Anne, small-scale Queen Anne houses in the city. It was originally the home of a farmer named A.O. Tailor, and that Tailor name still lives on in Lincoln. The family one time owned the square mile between 56th and 70th Street and A and O Streets, and Taylor Meadows, and that whole section of town recall the name of the Tailors. Across the street from it, the home actually of the landlord of Tailor Cottage is a house we'd call an American four-square. We don't very often see two-story columns on them, and in this example, these were added from another house that was torn down, but I think look very well on the house, giving it a little second-story porch as well as the first story. A little further down N Street, a house that's just a couple years older than Tailor Cottage, which dates to about 1890. This house dates about 1887, 1889, but in style is quite a bit earlier. It's what we would call an Italianate style, tall and narrow, a pretty simple mass of the house rather than the ins and outs of Tailor Cottage, and particularly has the tall narrow windows, the lower hipped roof, and the bracketed eaves, here with double brackets, nicely picked out in black on the white trim. This was the house of, I forget sometimes, this was Mr. Bagley's house, James Bagley, who was a stationary engineer for the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, working in their roundhouse. That would be in now what we call West Haymarket. Just down the street, another house that displays some of the features of the Queen Anne style in the ornate bay window that ornaments the N Street north side, but otherwise a little house that would be kind of a small version of the American four-square. This is the Langan House, also dates about 1890 or so. And was another Burlington worker, a train dispatcher. The Langan family, though, were printers working for various print shops in town, particularly Nebraska State Journal. At the corner of 28th and N Streets, one of the largest houses on our tour, built for Helen and Hollis Wood about 1892. A lot of its ornament has been lost over the years, but it has the very unusual Lincoln feature of a tall corner tower with a great steep hipped roof, so steep that some people like to call these witch's cap on that steep roof on the corner tower. Wraparound porch that emphasizes its special corner placement, and just a lovely big house. Mr. Wood was a real estate dealer, and he and his family occupied the house for about 30 years. Its neighbor to the west is one of the finest houses on the tour, a very substantially built bungalow of 1919, built by a contractor for his own family. R.O. Stake was the builder of it. He built lots of houses and commercial buildings as well. And he often was building designs from the Lincoln architect George Berlinghoff, and Berlinghoff was the designer of this beautiful little brick bungalow. The glassed-in front porch appears to date from not the very beginning of the house, but real early in its history. Maybe it was even a change in the original construction. And the house also features a green ceramic tile roof and stuccoed eaves. There's very little wood exposed on this house. It's built like a commercial building, has reinforced concrete basement, and it's just a very beautiful and substantially built and lovely designed house. Kitty corner across the street from it is John Oberle's house, one of the earlier ones on the tour, may date as early as 1883, and features considerable Queen Anne features in the fish scale shingle at the gable end and between the first and second floors, bay windows, some false half timbering way up at the gable peak. The porch is probably an early 20th century feature. Most of the Queen Anne houses in Lincoln had their porches modernized a century or so ago. Must have been mostly a matter of style, because most of them were replaced when the porches still would have been quite new on the house. Oberle's was another great four-square with one of those. West across the street from Mr. Oberle's house was Charles Vouchers' house. Dates to about 1900. This would be a house that's beginning to show the features that we would call American four-square. A boxy house with a hip roof, and this example, still brackets under the eaves and a bay window towards the north side, but a one-story porch that stretches all the way across the main east facade, ornamented with a little pediment to show you just where the staircase was. So it's fancier than we would see on later American four-squares, but it displays the basic features. At 217 South 28th is another early version of the American four-square. This is Archer Englebrot's house. He was a chief clerk on the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad. The house was built about 1902. It's not a pure American four-square because the front facade goes in and out, but the porch stretches across and kind of evens out that front facade. So that L-shaped plan is still more of a 19th century feature, but the house is definitely moving towards the 20th century. Back on the east side of the street, at 220 South 28th, is another house of 1902, but it displays in simpler fashion where house styles were going in the early 20th century, and on the exterior at least is purely an American four-square. Cubic mass of the house, a low hip roof with flared eaves, and a one-story porch that stretches all the way across the front. On the inside, this house, particularly in its woodwork and the surrounds of the windows and the doors, which feature bullseye molding at the corners, looks very 19th century in style. But of course, a builder could always buy leftover features or probably discounted features at the lumber yard from earlier styles and use them on a house that on the exterior was more modern looking. Beside the 220 South 28th, we have a late 20th century bungalow duplex. This was a house built on infilling a vacant lot, and the design picked up some of the bungalow features, the repeating gable roofs at the front and the half porch across the front of the houses around it in the neighborhood in order to fit better with the character of the area, but produce a apartment house, a two-unit apartment bungalow. And I think it was a pretty successful design. Certainly fits better in the neighborhood than its neighbor apartment building of a slightly earlier era that, while very nicely maintained, was designed and built without any windows or doors facing the street. Only the hose bib and the dryer vent welcome people walking by. The corner across the street was Reverend Bentley's house. Charles Bentley and his wife Persis built this house about 1900. Its style looks back towards the 19th century with the uneven, or the irregular units, not a single cube, but a L-shaped plan across the front and then a rear wing towards the back, now covered in asbestos shingle, so a little harder to see the features, but generally in its shape, a Queen Anne style. Its neighbor to the south is an early house in the neighborhood that has a simple single band of fish scale shingle just under the eaves and a bay window on the side facing to the north. The little porch had been lost in the early years of the house and was added when NeighborWorks housing agency rehabbed the house for selling to a single-family owner. The porch was designed to match the generally Italianate appearance of the tall, narrow house and tall, narrow windows, and gave the house back a nice street facade with a little sitting porch. The house at 2050 South 28th is called the Nelson Becker House. Nelson was the builder around 1910, and he's building in that American four-square style, but doesn't put a full-length porch on the front, just emphasizes the entrance with a handsome little portico. And we see that in some of the fancier houses of the second and third decades of the 20th century. Also adds a nice sun porch to the south side. I like this house for its green shutters with the nice Irish-American shamrock cutouts in the shutters. The Becker family lived in this house from about 1933 through the 40s and 50s. Behind it on the same lot is this American four-square at 2818 M Street. The same family that owned the corner house owned this house, and they, a couple times in the history of the houses, moved back and forth from one to the other. This house was also built by the builder C.A. Nelson, and he was the family that retained it for many years. It's an American four-square, but has a very substantial brick porch and then handsome columns or piers on top of the brick pedestals. They're ornamented more like the craftsman features of some of the bungalows than the columns we typically see on the American four-squares. Its neighboring house to the east at 255 South 29th is the Sinclair House, built about 1903-1904 for Alexander and Dora Sinclair. She lived here until her death in 1929. Mr. Sinclair was a clerk for the Railway Mail Service. His wife Dora was the daughter of Paul Shimke, an early state senator from Nebraska City. Either they had money, or being a railway mail clerk must have been lucrative, because this is a very big and very nicely ornamented house. The front porch has a wonderful collection of columns and piers. At the corners, it combines a square pier at the corner with the round columns flanking it. Proceeding south on South 29th, from the bungalow at the corner, is a more unique house at 320 South 29th, the Town House, built by C.C. Bickle. But this house, as we can claim for only a few on the tour, we know to be architect designed. Jesse Boaz Miller designed it. It's a variation on the bungalow. Doesn't have the sweeping porch. In fact, there's barely a porch at the entrance, more an open terrace. But beside it, a sun porch, nicely enclosed in brick, and handsome ornament in the muntins, the little sticks that make up the window panes. The upper sash on both the first and second floors have a handsome decorative pattern of muntins. Sharing the block face with the townhouse It's a beautiful row of 3 American foursquares, 2 frame, and the center one, this handsome brick house. We call it the George Toll House at 338 South 29th, built in 1916. Toll was a partner in the architectural millwork company of Curtis, Toll and Payne, who had a big factory at 6th and J Streets. And he built this very substantial house for an estimated $3,000 according to the building permit. And it's really a great centerpiece to this row of American foursquares. Its south neighbor is the Allen Toll House, built about 1909 by Alfred Westland. This was estimated to cost $2,500 when it was built. Across the street is an unusual house called the Critchfield House, built in 1920. Its builder was George Ridgway, who in early Lincoln directories listed himself as a carpenter, and then through the 1920s called himself an architect, probably self-trained and self-identified. He definitely had design skills and produced some very interesting houses. This one he's combining what was probably originally an open terrace at the entrance with a flat-roofed sunroom that provided a deck above it. There's a matching house to this one, also 1920, that George Ridgway built at 2834 Stratford Avenue. So this was a design that he was interested in exploring. A more conventional bungalow sits at the corner at 353 South 29th, built in 1920 by Adolf Hansen for George and Nora Litke. Mr. Litke was the yard manager for a coal company, and they resided in the house about 10 years. Across the street, a more ornate bungalow built in 1914 by Aspen Green and Zimmer for Mrs. Mary Lind, a widow, and her daughter. Has the nice feature of a corner house of extending the porch out beyond the walls of the house on both of the corner faces, so it almost sits like a little pergola at the side of the house. Also has nice extending eaves and brackets of the Craftsman bungalow style. And kitty corner across the street from it, a house that kind of blends a small American foursquare and a bungalow-like porch, now enclosed. Back on South 28th Street at 347, we have one of the earliest houses on the tour, Mr. Marsland's house, built in the early 1890s. Thomas Marsland was a baggage agent for Burlington, Missouri River Railroad, and then was the secretary and treasurer for a broom company in Lincoln. He sold the house in 1909 and moved to Boston. One of my favorite houses on the tour, and a real spectacular Woods Park house at the corner of 28th and L Streets at 405 South 28th, is the Daniel Kelly House, built in 1906 by J.A. Sumner. And he built for Daniel Kelly, who was a horse importer and stallion dealer. At various times he was partner with the Woods brothers, who were developing this area as Elm Park addition. And at various times Mr. Kelly had his own horse farm down on part of what's now Antelope Park at about 29th and A Streets. and at other times he was a partner with the Woods brothers, who had a stallion importing business of their own. This is a very ornate and large example of an American four-square with beautiful Palladian windows at the attic gables and a full-length front and rear porch on the east and west sides. Across the street at 426 South 28th is the Ludwig Tailor House, built by George McGonigal in 1908 of the new innovative material for that time in Lincoln, concrete block. This is quite a bit more ornate and richly detailed than many of the earliest concrete block houses, featuring not only block walls but also a block front porch with very stout piers and even cast concrete porch railing. Mr. Ludwig was a department manager for Armstrong Clothing Company. He lived in the house for about 11 years, then Ludwig sold it in 1919 to Mrs. Anna Taylor, a widow, who lived here until 1950. The Elm Park Landmark District has a great collection of American four-squares, and one of the very best ones is the Gannon House at 500 South 28th, beautifully positioned on a high terrace. It features a spectacular leaded glass window with keystones surrounding it at the middle of the second story, and also has lovely interior features to go with the high and stately exterior. Mr. Gannon and his neighbor to the north were both clerks of the Railway Mail Service, as was Mr. Sinclair of the big house on South 29th Street. Mrs. Gannon continued to live here several years after her husband's death, and was still a resident of the house in the mid-1930s. The neighboring house to the south of the Gannons may have been a farmhouse in the area. It sits on a double lot and shows up in the earliest views of the neighborhood. This area was platted in 1905 by the Woods brothers, and there apparently were a few houses on the ground before the Woods brothers started developing it. And the oldest portions of this house likely were one of those preceding houses. The earliest known residents were Charles and Mary Boynton, who were living here in 1911. He was a treasurer of Carter Transfer and Storage, which operated from a building at 8th and Q in Haymarket. One of the smallest houses on this stretch of South 28th Street is this little bungalow, built in 1914 by a man who advertised himself as the Bungalow Man, Edward A. Gerke. He built it for about $2,000 and sold it to William and May Gray. Gerke's advertising line was "Marry the girl, then see Edward Gerke, the Bungalow Man." He built starter houses for new families, and this was one of those. In many of his houses, when we've tracked their ownership pattern, they were owner-occupied, but often for just a couple of years, and then another family would come in and get their start there. So Mr. Gerke's business model seemed to serve him and his buyers well. Across the street from Mr. Gerke's bungalow is the Hagmann House at 535 South 28th, built in 1911 by W.H. Eady. This house has a combination of American four-square features and what kind of have a Swiss chalet feel in the projecting gable end over the second-story windows and the very light stick-like brackets. Beautifully maintained house. Across the street from Gerke's bungalow is the Eidelman House at 525 South 28th. built in 1909 by George McDougall, who was quite versatile because he built the concrete Ludwig house down the block as well, just the year before. His clients here were Pearl and Anson Eidelman. Mr. Eidelman, like his neighbor down the street, was employed by Armstrong Clothing Company as a salesman and department manager. This house combines American Foursquare and more bungalow-like features, with the combination of clapboard on the lower floor and shingle on the upper floor, handsome brackets, and it's just a beautifully maintained house as well. Our tour took a welcome rest stop at this American Foursquare. Not the classic Foursquare of 2 or 2.5 stories, but rather a story and a half, with stout cast concrete porch columns and handsome brickwork that uses a dark brick at the basement level and then a lighter brick for the upper walls, but then retains the dark brick for window trim and corner trim. Handsome architect designed, very interesting and unique house, and beautifully maintained by the generous folks who let us stop for cookies and refreshments in their front yard. Woods Park features 2 designated landmark districts of the city of Lincoln. The Elm Park East Lincoln Landmark District and the Woods Park Bungalow Landmark District. We feature a couple bungalows on this part of the tour. The little streets of South 30th, 31st, Marshall, and Elmwood are the bungalow streets stretching from Randolph to J Street, just south of Woods Park. They were platted individually, unlike the larger East Lincoln and Elm Park plats, and Mr. Vore platted South 30th Street, and this was his house, a large bungalow with sort of some Mission Revival style features in that second story dormer on the front with the big piers beside it, looking as if maybe they want us to think about adobe. House also sits on a beautiful double lot. Mr. William Vore built it about 1911 after having platted this ground just the year before. He occupied the house with his 2 daughters. Juliet was the assistant registrar at the University of Nebraska, and Anna was an elementary school teacher. Anna remained in the house at least through 1950. Neighboring house to the north at 610 South 30th Street is called the Theobald House. While this land was platted in 1910, this house appears to be quite a bit earlier, maybe as much as 20 years earlier in style, and probably was a farmhouse in the area that was shuffled around to fit on the lot once it had been replatted by Mr. Vore. Theobald, Clement Theobald, with his brother Herbert, operated Star Real Estate Company that built many of the houses in this area. This house suffered a devastating fire about a decade ago and was beautifully rebuilt by its family and is a real gem in the neighborhood today. Next to the Theobald House is the Brace House, handsome little bungalow at 600 South 30th, built in 1913. Its builder was a contractor, architect, developer named Sidney Otis Hahn. His building permit price for this house was $3,000. Hahn built many houses, often occupying them for a few years while he would build the next one. And as he would sell each one, apparently would accumulate the capital for his next project, moving his family year to year to whichever house he had just finished working on. This house he sold to Willis Brace and his wife Harriet. Brace was a traveling salesman. The second floor dormer was built as a sun porch or a sleeping porch. The windows would hinge away and be secured by a hook at the ceiling for full ventilation across the front. Some folks even spent their winters on sleeping porches like that, believing it helped prevent tuberculosis. Our tour winds back to South 29th Street to look at a nice collection of American foursquares between J and L Streets. First of those is the Holmes House at 545 South 29th, built in 1913 by A.L. Ferrier Company. Very substantial bungalow with ornate brackets and nice little hoods over the side windows, a unique porch with square piers at the corners and additional little brackets on those piers. Louis and Alma Holmes bought the house in 1914. He was an appraiser and land examiner for Woodward Brothers, who were a real estate and investment company in Lincoln. And over the years, 5 grown Holmes children resided here while they established their careers. Sons Henry and Neil ran a tire company. Joseph was an eye, ear, nose, and throat doctor. Adeline was a teacher, and her sister Marion was a student at UNL. Family remained in the house about a decade. Up the street from the Holmes is one of the most unusual American foursquares on the tour. Shows the range of decoration that could occur on these boxy houses. This is the Susong House, built in 1908 by D.B. Howard. His client, Arthur M. Susong, was an agent for a lumber company from Des Moines, and then became vice president and president of the company, Wheeler Lumber and Bridge Company. And it looks like on this house they're displaying the wares of their building supply or building material company. House was sold in 1920 to the Davis family, and they resided in the house for over half a century. The house features Tudor Revival elements, which are very unusual in American foursquare, but the half timbering on the front of the porch and in the gable ends is Tudor in style. Both on the outside and the inside, the house is just a rich array of the decorative features that you apparently could buy from Mr. Susong. Another handsome American foursquare just up the hill also features the second story elliptical window of its neighboring house to the west on South 28th Street. This house had all been wrapped in synthetic siding, and a previous owner carefully took all that off and repainted and repaired the house and lets it show in its glory again. Across the street, an unusual house in brick with a concrete block foundation that features an arched second floor porch under a gambrel roof. This house has been a rental for many years, but displays an interesting range of features on what basically is an American foursquare underneath that unusual roof. At the corner of South 29th and L Streets, at 402 South 29th, is what I think is the earliest house on our tour. May have been built as early as 1880 for John Humphrey Barrett, who was a farmer who lived in this vicinity, according to the city directories, and owned all of the land around this area. Mechanic liens filed in 1880 tell us that Barrett was constructing a house at that time, and this was probably that little house. The Barrett heirs sold the farm to the Woods brothers in 1905, and they subdivided the land into the current house lots, but immediately sold this property to Granville and Melinda Hickett for about $2,500. That was not the price in those days of a house lot. That more likely included this house already sitting there, the early farmhouse of the area before it developed. And finishing our tour on South 30th Street, a very handsome pair of American four-squares displaying two variations of the style. The corner example with a hip roof and a porch with square clustered piers on high brick pedestals. Beside it, a gable-roofed American four-square with a Palladian window in the gable end. Both beautifully maintained and a very handsome pair of houses.